Start up Blender and load the project that you want to light. In this video, we'll be using a simple kettles demo scene. Download link to the project files is in the description below, so feel free to follow along. Before you start lighting, always make sure your camera and the renderer is set up. In this example, we'll be rendering in cycles. Now, let's go to World Properties to access the HDR Light Studio connection add-on controls. Clicking on HDR Light Studio reveals all controls to do with the add-on. If you are not seeing a HDR Light Studio section in your World Properties, it's likely that the add-on was not installed correctly. In that case, refer back to our installation instructions. Link will be in the description below. We are now ready to begin the lighting process. With that being said, on the add-on panel, click on the Start button to start HDR Light Studio. Whilst HDR Light Studio is launching, it creates a new world in Blender called HDRLS World. This is the case even if a non-HDRLS world already exists in the project. We want to leave that alone. HDR Light Studio has finished launching, but let's minimize it for a second and go back to Blender to see what's changed. As soon as the HDRLS world is set up for your project, HDR Light Studio from now on will use that world to connect to in order to take control of lighting in your project. Whilst being in the shading workspace layout, and if we choose world as the type of data to take shader from, then ensure we are looking at HDRLS world. We can see that a shader network was created where the environment texture uses an image data block called HDRLS world text. This image data block will reference an up-to-date temporary HDR IMAP file updated by HDR Light Studio. Check out our video on the HDRLS world behavior. Link will be in the description below. Let's go back to HDR Light Studio. Your interface should look something like this. If it doesn't, you can go to Window, Layout, Load, Default, Blender. At this point, you have two options depending on how many displays you have. You can either light using HDR Light Studio on one display and Blender on the other, or we can rearrange the user interface in a way that will allow you to intuitively work on one display. In this example, we'll be lighting using HDR Light Studio with Blender on one display. For this, we have to bear in mind that we want to design our lighting in HDR Light Studio, but still be able to see the interactive render view in Blender, which can be started by clicking on the viewport shading rendered icon on Blender's user interface. Okay, let's start by moving HDR Light Studio to the top left of your display and scale down slightly, but maintain the same height as Blender's interface. We can now start dragging out and moving our panels to where we want them. When moving panels, make sure you are dragging by the panel name and not the panel tab, as this will not work. So let's drag out the Light Properties panel and move it to the right. We can also move panels and tab them. For example, we can move the Render View Settings panel onto the Presets panel and it will now be tabbed and you can switch between them. Using those techniques, we can rearrange the HDR Light Studio interface to our recommended arrangement. So the light preview is going to go up here. Our HDR Light Studio render view can go down here. And let's drag out the canvas all the way here. Then we can make the main HDR Light Studio app window a bit narrower. And now notice how I am clicking on Blender's interface in attempt to go to Blender and put HDR Light Studio behind it. I want to resize the Blender render view to fit in more nicely with my HDR Light Studio interface arrangement. But the HDR Light Studio interface seems to always want to be at the top. This is because by default we have an option enabled to do this exact thing for us, but we can disable it if we want to by going to Window and unticking the Always on Top option. Now if we click on Blender's interface, HDR Light Studio will be put behind Blender's window. It's good to be in the shading workspace layout as it allows us to scale the Blender render view according to our HDR Light Studio user interface arrangement. Let's just make some fine changes to the height and width of some of those panels. Okay, now we can save this layout, and whenever you like with HDR Light Studio and Blender, you can load this user interface layout to save you from having to rearrange it every time. In fact, HDR Light Studio will always load with the last layout used with Blender, but if you messed up your panels, it's always good to be able to load it back in easily. In HDR Light Studio, simply go to Window, Layout, Save, and click on one of the preset slots and give this layout a name. In this example, we'll call this My Blender Layout. Let's say your user interface has gone back to being in its default arrangement. You can now go to Window, Layout, Load, User, My Blender Layout, or whatever you have named this layout. Currently, the HDR IMAP design is shared with Blender as a low-resolution temporary proxy image file. This is to allow Blender during the iterative lighting design process to calculate and load the lighting design faster. What this means is that when the lighting design changes in HDR Light Studio, this image is updated in Blender to use a new temporary HDR file with a new file name, to ensure the renderer uses the new image even when caching images. Let's continue with the basics of using HDR Light Studio with Blender. If we press the play button on the render view, the Import Scene Geometry panel will pop up, and by pressing Import, we can import the current frame of our scene. If a subdivision surface modifier is applied to meshes, this will also be applied to the exported scene. The scene is exported into HDR Light Studio as a temporary alembic file, and a simple shader is used to preview the light and reflections. There's another way to send your 3D scenes into HDR Light Studio. Going back to the add-on panel inside Blender, we can see additional export settings that we can tweak if we want to give ourselves more control of what is exported. We would then simply click on the Export Scene Geometry button and the scene will be exported into HDR Light Studio. Let's return to HDR Light Studio. We will use the render view in HDR Light Studio for positioning lights on the scene, and the render view in Blender to see what our lighting looks like in cycles. Right then, we're ready to make our first light. In this panel, we have a variety of preset lights that we can drag and drop onto our model. If you don't see preset lights in this panel, refer to our online help for preset installation. Link will be in the description below. By default, light paint is set to reflection mode, so the light we have just placed is positioned to reflect in our chosen location on the 3D scene when using light paint. We can see our new light in the light list. We can also see the light added to the canvas here. The environment texture in Blender has been updated to use the new live HDR IMAP from HDR Light Studio. We can see that the light paint tool is active in the toolbar within HDR Light Studio render view. We can use this tool to click and drag on the 3D scene to reposition our light. The light has now moved on the HDR IMAP and the new HDR IMAP is sent to Blender. This is a very interactive way of lighting your shot. So far, the light we have created is on the HDR IMAP. With a single setting, we can remove this light from the HDR IMAP and create it in 3D space inside Blender. We can create area type lights in two ways. First one using mesh emitters and the second one using Blender area lights. In the add-on panel inside Blender, we can choose our area light type here. Area light type is a global setting and will determine the type of all area lights made by HDR Light Studio in the scene. It is also dynamic, meaning that the setting can be changed at any time to convert all area lights made by HDR Light Studio from mesh emitters to Blender area lights and vice versa. In this example, we'll be using mesh emitters mapped with the HDR content from HDR Light Studio. You can learn more about which type of area light is more suitable for your workflow needs and your project in our video detailing the advantages and disadvantages of each one, including examples of which one you would want to use when. Link will be in the description below. Now let's go back to HDR Light Studio and we can check the area light checkbox in the light properties panel for the selected light. This light now gets the suffix area light and is in yellow in the light list, clearly showing which lights are area lights. Although this view might look like it hasn't changed much, the map that is shared with Blender doesn't include this light anymore. This light is now a 3D mesh plane with emissive material applied to one side and is mapped with the HDR light content from HDR Light Studio, which can be seen lighting the shot in Blender. Very quickly, let's increase the brightness of this light so we can see its effect on our scene more clearly. Let's move this 3D light in space using the Smart Dolly slider to control its distance from the light paint position, so we can see it in the Blender render view. If you feel like the area lights are too close or too far by default when using the slider, or if you feel like the slider is not sensitive enough or too sensitive even, we can look at adjusting the Smart Dolly scalar value in Preferences. By default it's at 1, so our Smart Dolly slider values will be multiplied by 1. For this scene, a Smart Dolly scalar of 0.1 will be ideal. Do check out our detailed video on Smart Dolly and Smart Dolly scalar to learn more about how they work together. Link is in the description. With area type lights, we can of course use light paint and control the light by clicking on the scene to position it, just like before. Now let's see what's changed in Blender. We can see our mesh emitter area light made by HDR Light Studio in the viewport. We can also see it in the outliner inside HDRLS area lights. And if we click on our light, we can see the shader setup that was created specifically for this area light that's mapped with HDR content. Okay, so let's maximize HDR Light Studio once again and add another light to make our design just a little bit nicer. I can also change the brightness of a light, the size, and any other settings like the colour for example. Check out our lighting project playlist to learn more about the art of lighting. Link is in the description. Let's say we are happy with this lighting design. The final step would be to press the HDR button from the toolbar on the left and render the high quality HDR IMAP file and area light textures on disk. We do this because as of now, the HDR IMAP design in HDR Light Studio is shared with Blender as a low resolution image, just like we have mentioned at the start of this video. So let's choose our resolutions. If you had any area lights in your lighting design, you can choose the resolution for those here as well. Okay, we're good, so let's click on Browse and choose the file name and location of our final HDR IMAP. And press Render. HDR Light Studio will now calculate the final high quality HDR IMAP and area light textures and save them to disk. It will then tell Blender to use these new files on disk. Now if we look at the lighting environment and its texture, it's using that file from disk. At this point we can stop HDR Light Studio and save your Blender project. This scene is now lit and is using files on disk as the textures. This is like any other Blender scene and can be rendered. If we were to stop HDR Light Studio without rendering our lighting design, your Blender scene would look something like this. This is because a standing blue logo is now lighting your scene, to make it obvious that Blender is not using a final HDR IMAP and that it needs to be rendered. You don't want Blender referencing a temporary low-res HDR IMAP in the scene file. If we decide we want to edit the lighting, we can do so by pressing Start and HDR Light Studio will start up again. Its lighting project is embedded in the Blender scene, so when HDR Light Studio starts, it will load the project where we left off. If we press play in the HDR Light Studio render view, we can see that the scene is being lit with this lighting. We can make further changes, so let's say we change the colour of one of these lights and re-render our lighting. The environment's texture has been updated to use our new file on disk, and we can stop the HDR Light Studio add-on once more and save our Blender project. This concludes the tutorial for how to use HDR Light Studio with Blender. Thank you for watching.